That was a sort of magical time in my life doing that. I mean, it's like a dream when you're there. It's those incredible beaches, that incredible life.
Picture the perfect job. Turquoise water outside your window, a beach 5 minutes from your desk, a killing to solve before lunch, and a team that already knows more about the island than you ever will. That's the promise of death in paradise. And yet, almost every single detective who has worn that badge on St. Marie has eventually packed a bag and walked away from paradise. Not one. Not two. Nearly every lead the show has ever had. So today we're asking the question fans have been arguing about for 15 years. Why can nobody stay? At first glance, this looks like a scheduling problem. Actors get tired, actors want new roles, actors miss their families back home. All of that is true and we'll get into it. But there's something bigger going on underneath the casting decisions, something built directly into the DNA of the show itself. St. Marie isn't just a pretty backdrop for a murder mystery. It's a machine that quietly repairs broken people, and once it finishes the repair, it has no more use for them. That is the real secret of death in paradise, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. Let's start with the most obvious clue, the pattern itself. Every single detective who has landed on that airport tarmac has arrived carrying some kind of damage. Not a criminal record, not a mystery villain past. Emotional damage. A wound they didn't come to the Caribbean to fix, because they didn't even know it needed fixing. And every single time the island finds it anyway. Take the very first one. D.I. Richard Poole steps off the plane in a full wool suit, sweating through his shirt within the first 10 seconds, horrified by the sand, offended by the heat, and personally insulted by the fact that nobody on St. Marie seems to care about punctuality. It's easy to read Richard as a comedy character, the uptight Englishman who can't cope with paradise. But underneath the jokes, Richard is a genuinely lonely man. He doesn't know how to let people in. Control is the only language he speaks fluently, and St. Marie, with its heat and its noise and its unpredictable rhythms, is a direct assault on everything that makes him feel safe. His brilliance as a detective and his total helplessness as a human being are the same trait wearing two different masks. Over 2 series, something remarkable happens to Richard almost against his will. He starts trusting his team. He starts noticing Camille as more than a colleague. He starts, very slowly, admitting that the island isn't simply broken London. It just runs on different rules. Fans watched that thaw happen in real time, which is exactly why what came next hit so hard. Richard Poole was killed off. Not written out with a transfer, not sent home for a family emergency, killed in the very first episode of Series 3, in a way that shocked the audience and made headlines. It felt almost cruel for a show this cozy. But it did something the writers desperately needed. It told the audience, once and for all, that nobody on St. Marie was safe from change, not even the man the whole show had been built around. Richard's death didn't end the format. It created it. Then came the impossible task of replacing him. Humphrey Goodman had to walk into a grieving fanbase and somehow not get compared to a ghost. The solution was simple but clever. Make him Richard's total opposite. Where Richard was buttoned up and defensive, Humphrey was warm, scattered, and painfully open about his feelings. He apologized to furniture. He tripped over his own conclusions and somehow still landed on the right suspect. But just like Richard, Humphrey arrived broken. His marriage back home had quietly fallen apart, and his confidence had gone with it. St. Marie became less of a workplace and more of a slow rebuild, not through big dramatic speeches but through friendship, routine, and the strange discovery that he actually belonged somewhere he never expected to. Humphrey's exit is different from Richard's in a way that matters. He didn't die and he didn't fail. He left because he found something worth chasing back home, and years later that thread got picked back up in the spin-off Beyond Paradise, proving a detective could leave the island and keep his story going instead of disappearing into memory. That was the show quietly teaching itself a second trick. Not every goodbye needs to be tragic. Some departures are simply growth finishing its job. Jack Mooney arrived next, and on the surface he looked like the easiest fit yet. Friendly, chatty, instantly likable, the kind of man who could get a suspect talking just by seeming harmless. But Jack was carrying grief, quietly, the way people do when they've decided the world doesn't need to see it. He'd lost his wife before coming to St. Marie, and the island gave him something he didn't know he needed. Distraction, warmth, a reason to get up in the morning that wasn't about surviving the day. He settled in faster and more comfortably than any detective before him. And that comfort became the exact reason he had to leave. Here's the part people underestimate about Jack's story. St. Marie could easily have become a beautiful place to hide. A man who's grieving can stay busy forever if the scenery is nice enough and the company is kind enough. Jack's departure wasn't triggered by failure or misery, It came from him realizing that healing isn't the same as moving forward, and that at some point you have to take the life you've rebuilt and actually go live it, rather than keep circling the same sunny street. He left while he still liked the place, which might be the healthiest exit any detective on this show has ever had. Then there's Neville Parker, and honestly, if you wanted to design a character scientifically engineered to suffer on a tropical island, you'd end up with Neville. Allergic to seemingly everything that grows, terrified of insects, uncomfortable with uncertainty, hyper-aware of every possible danger in a room. By this point in the show's run, audiences had already learned the rhythm. New detective arrives, struggles, softens, eventually leaves. So the writers needed something bigger to keep people invested. Their answer was patience. Instead of a quick transformation, Neville's arc unfolded across years. He didn't just learn to tolerate the climate. He learned to tolerate risk itself. Professional risk, emotional risk, the risk of actually loving someone and staying open to getting hurt by it. Watching Neville fall for Florence over multiple series, watching him stumble and overthink and occasionally get it catastrophically wrong, gave the show one of its longest emotional through lines. He never stopped being anxious. He never became a smooth, confident action hero. But he stopped being ruled by fear completely, and that distinction is what made his eventual exit feel earned rather than convenient. When Neville finally left with Florence, it wasn't him running from the island. It was arguably the single bravest choice he'd made in his entire time there, choosing an uncertain future on purpose with his eyes open. By the time Ralph Little departed, he'd played the role longer than anyone before him, which only made the show's next move riskier. That next move is D.I. Mvín Wilson. And here's where things get interesting because by now the audience isn't shocked by a new arrival anymore. They expect it. The challenge for a fifth lead isn't surprise, it's relevance. The writers can't lean on novelty the way they did with Richard, or warmth the way they did with Humphrey. So Mvín arrives with a different kind of friction entirely, guardedness. He's not clumsy or grieving or phobic in the way we've seen before. He's a man who has decided, somewhere along the way, that staying closed off is safer than being known. Which means the real question of his era isn't will he learn to like the island, it's what exactly is he protecting himself from, and will St. Marie manage to get past his walls the way it got past everyone else's? That question is really the engine of the entire show if you step back far enough. Every murder case on St. Marie runs in parallel with a second, quieter mystery. What's actually going on inside the detective's head? The victims change every week. The suspects change every week. But the emotional investigation of the lead character is the case that never technically closes, it just gets handed off to the next person wearing the badge. And that leads to the biggest realization about why this show survives cast changes that would sink almost any other series. The true main character of Death in Paradise was never the detective. It's the island itself. Think about the constants. The police station with its ceiling fan that never quite keeps up, Catherine's bar as the unofficial evening meeting point, Commissioner Selwyn Patterson watching over everything with quiet, weary authority, the same white sand crime scenes glowing under the same relentless sun. Detectives are visitors passing through a world that was fully alive before they arrived and stays fully alive after they leave. Compare that to a show like Morse, where losing the lead effectively ends the show's world along with him. St. Marie doesn't work that way. The island simply waits for the next confused officer to step off the plane, slightly sunburned and completely unprepared. That's also why the supporting cast matters so much more than people give it credit for. Camille, Dwayne, Fidel, JP, Florence, these characters have come and gone too for entirely different reasons, career moves, family, growth of their own. But the show has always been careful never to change everything at once. One departure here, one new face there, one returning favorite showing up at exactly the right moment. That balance keeps the world feeling alive rather than frozen, and it keeps the audience from ever feeling completely abandoned, because there's always someone left who remembers how things used to be. Selwyn Patterson is the clearest example. He's watched every single detective arrive, struggle, and leave, and that continuity gives the whole show an emotional memory that outlasts any individual actor's contract. It's worth pausing on just how different each of these men actually were because the contrast is the whole trick. If Richard had simply been followed by another rigid, awkward Englishman, the show would have felt like it was repeating itself before it even had a chance to breathe. Instead, the writers treated every casting change like a reset button for the entire emotional tone of the series. Humphrey wasn't just less stiff than Richard. He was almost his mirror image, all elbows and apologies, tripping into brilliance rather than calculating his way there. Jack wasn't just calmer than Humphrey. He carried a stillness that came from loss, not personality, which gave the show access to a kind of quiet sadness it hadn't really used before. Neville wasn't simply more anxious than Jack. His fear was systemic, woven into nearly every scene, which meant the show could mine comedy and vulnerability from the exact same source for years without it feeling repetitive. Each new lead didn't just replace the last one. He forced the whole show to speak a slightly different emotional language for as long as he stayed. That's part of why casting a new detective on this show is such a high-wire act. Get it wrong and you either feel like a cheap copy of someone the audience already loved, or you feel so disconnected from the tone of the show that nothing lands. Get it right and you give the format a reason to exist for another few years. It's a strange kind of pressure to put on an actor. Not just play a police officer solving crimes, but personally justify why the whole show still deserves to be on air. So why does this actually work as a franchise rather than just as a strange casting habit? Because the show turned its biggest apparent weakness into its signature strength. Most crime dramas treat the lead detective as sacred, untouchable, the one element you're never allowed to lose. Death in Paradise flipped that completely. It built its identity around the idea that the detective is temporary and the island is permanent. Every actor who leaves takes their version of the role with them, but they leave something behind too. Richard proved a show like this could survive brutal shock. Humphrey proved it could survive warmth without losing its edge. Jack proved it could survive grief without becoming heavy. Neville proved it could sustain years of slow emotional payoff. Each one taught the format something new about itself, and each lesson stayed baked into the show long after the actor said goodbye. There's also a very human reason all of this keeps happening, separate from the writing. Filming on location in the Caribbean sounds like paradise from the outside, but the reality behind the camera is months away from home, intense heat, long shooting days, and a level of separation from family that gets harder to justify the longer it goes on. Actors have said in interviews over the years that family commitments and the sheer physical demands of the shoot played a real part in their decisions to move on. That's not a twist or a secret. It's simply the practical cost of making a show this beautiful look effortless every single week. But even with that practical reality sitting underneath everything, the creative logic is what makes the departures feel meaningful instead of random. A detective arrives uncomfortable in some deep, specific way. The island exposes that discomfort instead of letting them hide from it. The team around them slowly earns their trust. The cases test them in ways that go beyond simply catching a killer. And by the time they've actually healed, actually grown into someone capable of belonging somewhere, the story they were brought in to tell has finished. If they stayed past that point, the show would either have to stop developing them completely or turn them into someone who no longer fits the original premise of an outsider learning to survive somewhere unfamiliar. Neither option works long-term. So the island lets them go and it starts again with someone new. There's another layer to this worth mentioning because it explains why the show didn't just survive its own cast changes. It turned them into a template other shows could borrow. Once Beyond Paradise proved that a character's story could keep going in a completely different setting, the door was open for the wider world to expand instead of staying locked to one island. Return to Paradise took the same emotional blueprint and moved it somewhere new again, and suddenly what looked like a single long-running procedural revealed itself as something closer to a shared universe, all built on the same underlying idea. A detective enters a close-knit community, the case of the week is only half the story, and the real plot is always the quiet transformation happening underneath it. That's a much harder thing to build than a hit show. It's a format flexible enough to outlive any single location, any single actor, and any single storyline, which is exactly why a series that keeps losing its lead character every few years has managed to keep growing instead of quietly fading out. None of this works, though, without the discipline to keep the tone balanced. Push the crimes too dark, and the show stops feeling like the comfort watch people put on after a long day. Push the comedy too far, and the mysteries stop feeling like they matter. Let the romance take over completely, and the show turns into something else entirely. Keep a detective around too long past their arc, and the fish-out-of-water premise collapses because they've genuinely become a local. Move on from a detective too soon, before the audience has had a chance to attach, and the exits start feeling disposable instead of meaningful. Death in Paradise has spent well over a decade walking that exact line, and the fact that audiences are still debating which detective they loved most is proof the balancing act keeps working. That's really the whole answer wrapped into one idea. St. Marie isn't a home in this story. It's a turning point. It's the place characters pass through on their way to becoming whoever they were always supposed to be, whether that means finding love, finding courage, finding peace with grief, or in Richard's case, simply proving that even loss can move a story forward instead of ending it. The crimes give the show its weekly rhythm, but the real mystery running underneath every single series is always the same one. Who is this person before the island gets to them, and who will they be by the time they finally leave? So the next time you watch a new detective step off that plane looking sunburned, overdressed, and completely out of his depth, remember what you're actually watching. It's not just another lead character being introduced. It's another person about to be quietly taken apart and rebuilt by an island that has done this before, and will keep doing it long after this detective has packed his bags too. Which detective's exit hit you the hardest? Richard, Humphrey, Jack, or Neville? Drop your answer in the comments, and if you enjoyed this breakdown, subscribe for more deep dives into the shows you thought you already understood.